So, one of the questions that people ask me as a pastor all the time is why are there so many versions or denominations of Christianity? Catholic, Episcopal, Lutheran, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, non denominational. Sometimes, sometimes it can look confusing from the outside because if Christianity is one faith, why does it seem so divided? But what if the existence of many denominations isn't a problem? What if, in some ways, it's actually a strength? In the United States, the diversity of churches reflects something very important: freedom of religion, freedom of thought, and freedom of conscience. Different Christian communities emphasize different parts of the tradition. Some focus on liturgy and ancient practices. Others emphasize personal conversion. Some center on social justice and service, and others focus on evangelism and outreach. Each version or stream of Christianity is trying, in its own way, to follow Jesus. And that diversity can be healthy. It leaves room for conversation, humility, and growth. But in recent decades, something interesting has happened to American Christianity. Beginning especially in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a particular style of evangelical Christianity began to grow very quickly. Many of these churches were called or labeled non denominational. And they were innovative. They used modern music, creative arts, contemporary language, and some new approaches to worship. And to be fair, some of that innovation was really important. My wife and I actually served on worship teams at one of the churches that helped pioneer that movement, Willow Creek Community Church. And in many ways, it became kind of a laboratory for a new model of church. Think of what Chipotle did for burritos. Burritos already existed, but Chipotle reimagined them, repackaged them, and made them accessible in a new way. And suddenly, millions of people were excited about something that had been around for a very long time. In some ways, that's what these churches did for Christianity. They experimented with new ways to communicate the gospel. They reached people who might never have walked into a traditional church. Good, right? But every innovation has trade-offs. In the process, some things that mainline Protestant churches had been refining for hundreds of years, things like theological nuance, historical context, and interpretive humility, sometimes got left behind. And over time, some versions of this movement began presenting Christianity in very black and white terms. Instead of saying Christians have wrestled with these questions for centuries, the message sometimes became this is the one correct interpretation, or this is the one correct way to believe, and, well, everyone else is wrong. That's a very bold claim when you're interpreting a collection of texts written thousands of years ago in different languages, cultures, and historical contexts. Christian teachers have always tried to interpret Scripture faithfully, but historically, there's always been this deep awareness of humility. In Jewish tradition especially, studying Scripture has always involved questions and debate, dialogue. Rabbis argue with the text and with each other. The goal isn't always to produce one final answer, it's to deepen wisdom. The Bible, after all, is an Eastern book written in cultures that often embraced mystery and conversation. But modern Western culture tends to prefer something else. We like certainty. We want someone to tell us the rules, define the boundaries, and explain exactly what we're supposed to think. In some forms of popular evangelical preaching over the past 40 years, pastors began to present their interpretations not as just one reading of Scripture, but as the authoritative reading. And that became dangerous because when one group claims absolute certainty about every theological question about salvation and politics, sexuality, the end times, and everything else, it leaves very little room for humility or conversation. It also risks making believers pastor dependent. Instead of teaching people how to read scripture thoughtfully for themselves, how to ask questions, study in context, wrestle with the text, some movements unintentionally trained people to simply follow the interpretation of a particular preacher or church. But Christian faith has never been meant to work that way. Faith is not someone else's relationship with God that we borrow. It's our own relationship with the divine, our own journey of prayer, study, questioning, and growth. Even the Apostle Paul warned leaders about speaking too confidently on God's behalf. In his letters, he cautions teachers to be careful, because those who teach will be held to a higher standard. In other words, be humble, be thoughtful, and recognize the limits of your certainty. Which brings us back to denominations. The fact that Christianity contains many different traditions, different interpretations, different emphasis can actually be a sign of something really healthy. It means no single group has control over the conversation. It means there's space for dialogue, learning, and growth. And maybe, most importantly, it reminds us that following Jesus is not about perfectly agreeing on every theological detail. It's about pursuing truth together with humility, with curiosity, and with the understanding that faith is not about controlling other people's beliefs. It's about faithfully living out our own.